And now the next panelist is the commentator, Steve Zdatny. He is a professor of history at the University of Vermont, the recipient of many grants and fellowships, including the American Philosophical Foundation, Franco-American Foundation, and others. His books are many. I'll just mention the most recent one, Fashion, Work, and Politics in Modern France. He's currently studying hygiene in modern France, and he is among a small handful of people in Burlington, Vermont, to have won men's league championships in both basketball and ice hockey. And
this could take some time. Okay, is that good? Okay, great. So I think of myself as a kind of an entrepreneuse. And I have been hired to start an argument and express my good. You know, this could be just an incredibly convincing bit of performative gender. Anyway, do what my wife calls my grumpy old man routine. So just a brief comment to throw some spaghetti at the wall and see what sticks, to challenge some of the things I've heard, and then hopefully, and oh God, it's a minute and a half already, to get out of the way. You know, the history of fashion's had kind of a dicey history. I think everybody knows Valerie Steele. Valerie Steele, who's really the greatest living ever has lived historian of French fashion, is not an academic. She's the director of the FIT Museum, largely because when she finished up her dissertation, the history of fashion was continued to be considered such lightweight stuff she couldn't get a job. My question, or the question I think always when we talk about fashion, is how to talk about it. So, do we think of it as mere frippery? The most epiphenomenal bit of epiphenomena, a kind of organized silliness by fashion designers trying to make a profit off people who have excess disposable income. A second question, is there a pattern to fashion? Is there some kind of fashion system? Some sort of logic that binds the forms to the historical context? And or alternatively, is fashion a system of free-floating and ultimately arbitrary forms? And I did this stuff on hair, and my ultimate statement on whether there was something determinative between the forms and the historical context was, if you looked at Cher and Charles II from the back, they looked the same. Which was my argument that hairstyles have no intrinsic meaning. Okay, so both Tamara and Keith raised the question, and they both focus on forms of, I'm not crazy about the word because it's so fashionable, transgressive fashions. In Tamara's case, she hones in on women wearing men's formal clothing in the room where transgression meets commerce, which is a pretty highly calculated provocation. Keith, I'll talk about Drew, of course, as well, but Keith finds transgression where there is meant to be mostly functionality. Some women want to wear shorts to épater le bourgeois, but for the most part, they just want less restricted movements. So I have to say for Tamara, and I love Tamara, and she's much smarter than I am, but I'm not that convinced by the semiotic fashion system as part of the performance act. That didn't strike me as the most interesting part of what you had to say. Just because it's pretty obvious, right? When I put on a tux, it's performative of the fact that I'm about to give somebody some money for something, right? Rather, I was struck by the entraîneuse dressed as butch or femme, depending on what the boss figured would bring in the shekels. So In fact, the fashion was struck me as rather a banal bit of marketing on the part of the cabaret owner, much in the way that a casino operator might have beautiful women delivering free drinks at the craps table. It's all about making money. And that the forms are, provocative. They're not arbitrary, but to me it was the commercial aspect that really caught my eye. The other thing that caught my eye was the incomprehension of the police. I get the sense from what you wrote that they don't really seem to be sure what they're looking at. And even in a room full of women who love other women, and these are your words, only the managed partner was considered a lesbian, which seems sort of odd, given presumably everybody in the room was a lesbian, right? So it was striking to me that the transgressiveness of the whole business was to be found in the clothing rather than in the lovemaking. I had another question, just because I'm curious. So was the detective posting, right? Boss calls the detective in and says, okay, here's your job tonight. I want you to go to Le Monacle and, take notes. Was this considered to be a plum posting for a detective, or did they, oh God, I hate that, right? Send me out to look at a murder. Keith wants us to think about whether sports and the clothes that went with them liberated women or reinforced the patriarchy. And it seems to me his answer is it depends who you ask. Most female athletes do it for the love of the game. And I suppose in that case, women's football or tennis, women's tennis or women's rugby is liberating. At the same time, though, I thought those who thought that women calling attention to their bodies was a dangerous business because it stimulated male lasciviousness, I think they might have been onto something. So as I'm reading that, I thought to myself, I'm going to look something up. And I couldn't remember Anna Kournikova. But it turns out if you Google hot Russian tennis players, she comes up right away. Right? So that was seemed to me indicative of a general role. So Keith looks at the transgressive and gender normative forms of sportswear, but his bigger question is to what extent can clothing styles contribute or detract from the cause of what we might call social justice, or are they simply a reflection of what's going on otherwise? Vichy, for me, was the most interesting moment in the story, and I think maybe for Keith as well, for being the most contradictory. And I look forward to hearing more about the way that a regime that seriously frowned upon, if it did not actually outlaw women wearing trousers, encourage women to wear shorts. Now, Drew interpolates yet another pivotal moment in the French history of fashion, asking whether it is really true that the fashions of André Courrèges are, quote, less a product of ascendant youth culture and more a product of the disruptive forces so often associated with the Trente Glorieuses. And my first question is, I need you to explain that to me because I didn't really catch the distinction in that. But Courrèges clearly has this youthful modernist shtick. He uses a lot of white. He calls himself an architect rather than a fashion designer. But how is his blah, blah, blah different from any other designer's blah, 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 right? They're all trying to sell themselves as something new. It's all about the marketing. This is the niche that Courrèges took for himself. How does that stand up? And again, what I found most interesting in this whole narrative about modernism wasn't the construction of the clothes. It was his decision to put ready to wear on a runway, which was the real modernism, I think, in what he was doing. maybe I missed something in the actual construction of Courrèges clothes. I'm not myself a historian of fashion. That was really unique and in particular harmony with the zeitgeist. But I have other things, but I'm going to stop because I want these guys to talk. So.
Okay, thank you. So, shall we ask? Yes, in the back, please.
Hi. This is great. Thank you very much. Hi, those are great. Thank you very much. My question is to Tamara. I was really interested in thinking about these entraîneuses sort of potentially arbitrarily becoming votre femme based upon the whims of their boss or perhaps their, I don't know why they made those decisions, but I was wondering if you have any insight into whether or not some of those women eventually took on the identity of those fashions within their private lives, or whether it stayed at work. Thank you.
Sure. I don't know if I should stand. I'll sit. I'll stay seated for the camera. Okay. Yeah, that's a great question. It's something that I actually refer to in the talk, which is that absolutely for Fred, for Dan Manel, who were the two examples that I gave. For some women, once they started to dress like that, they adopted that. And Fred, for example, never went back to dressing like a woman for the rest of her life. So it was really kind of a formative thing. One of the things that was really interesting to me was that in the police archives, when I was looking at these entraîneuses dossiers, there was one, there are photographs. I can't use these, of course, because it's all sous dérogation. But there are photographs of an entraîneuse working at two different times in her career. Once as a woman, feminine, once as a woman, masculine. That was really interesting to me to see, because working for a different person in a different place. My guess is that that is not usually the way that it worked. I think that for many women who stayed in the profession for a long time, one of the reasons that they did, because an entraîneuse was often a very kind of fly-by-night type of job, and so it was interesting to study. With 100 of them, I could really get a sense of what their career trajectory was. The ones who tended to stay tended to be masculine. And I think it's because it was a place that was permissible and where they could embody their desires in ways that were possible for them.
No, that's exactly
Yeah, sure. Thank you.
Thanks for three great papers. I have a question for Drew, of course. So I'm thinking about what you're talking about, this kind of disruption of the fashion industry, and I wonder what you might think about in terms of the appearance of this, maybe like semi-high fashion in new places. So, I mean, you talk about Françoise Hardy, so like the appearance of high fashion in like youth magazines, as opposed to say like the typical type of media associated with fashion. So we have fashion aimed, like magazines aimed at younger readers. They're on the covers. These kind of female pop stars, if you will, appearing in television specials, dressed in these fashions. So is that also part of this kind of disruption of the fashion industry, kind of its appearance in new media spaces? And I guess the kind of a second question is, was Courrèges kind of actively looking to kind of new types of models, right? Again, like someone like Françoise Hardy, not a model per se, but a kind of new type of celebrity in this post-war period. I think about like Chris Tinker's work here, right? So are these kind of celebrities, if you will, a new type of fashion model, like that we understand now in the contemporary period? Thanks.
So, in short, yes. So it's, I mean, as well as I do. It's interesting the way pop stars like Françoise Hardy kind of, and Sylvie Vartan, all of these people emerged as not simply symbols of new music, but also new models for other kind of young people to follow. And so I think that's certainly a huge case. But I guess I actually want to maybe back up from that a little bit. And the reason I was really driving home the idea of youth rather than simply young people themselves was because I have received this narrative about how it is young people. And so the assumption is someone like Françoise Hardy, who of course is going to be the sort of disruptor of this new fashion. And that's why this sort of youthquake narrative is so pervasive. And what kind of struck me was when I would be reading about the types of women buying Courrèges, it was people like Lyndon Johnson's wife and other sorts of names that middle-aged women that aren't associated with the sort of Françoise Hardy kind of teenager aesthetic, right? And
Because they can afford it.
yeah, well, we should probably make that point that haute couture.
Yeah, they can afford it. It's expensive.
It's incredibly expensive, and so to me, it's more compelling as to why was there such an obsession with youth and this quality of being young that did transcend actual young people who certainly couldn't afford these very elite exclusive fashions, right? And so to me, if I were to speak more broadly about the sort of disruption of fashion, it is interesting how many young people themselves were actually indifferent to haute couture, and the ways in which all sorts of new forms of ready-to-wear by designers who had no affiliation to this sort of long history of haute couture were the designers designing for young people. That to me was the real disruption. And so it's interesting to me how people like Courrèges kind of slot themselves into this new framework while maintaining some level of distinction and prestige, but also trying to make sense of a new marketplace.
Go ahead. Oh, sure. Yeah, no, I have questions for my co-panelists, but go ahead.
Okay, I have one for your co-panelists, too, for Drew, actually. And I liked your paper a lot, and it's very far outside of my own research area. So I am a researcher in gender in the 19th century. And so one thing that I found very interesting that you didn't talk about was gender, but that's not to say like every paper has to be about that, but your descriptions of the way people talked about Courrèges were like, he's an architect, he's constructing clothes, he's not sewing them, he's a visionary. And it kind of made me think about how there's this research about student evals and how like women professors are never called geniuses, but men are. I feel like tomorrow your students must call you a genius in your evals, but but generally it's like that's very gendered, and I felt like the language used that I couldn't tell if that was him describing himself, sort of his self-construction, or what other people put upon him, but it seemed like he's not just modern, and I did buy that, the sort of technocratic element of like he's an architect, not just someone making clothes. But he's also overtly masculine, and is he doing that contra Chanel, for example, like as opposed to being feminine. The other place where I saw gender in there that I thought was really funny and very surprising, but also in a predictable way, is that he's talking about these white clothes, dirty. I'm like, this guy has probably never used a washing machine or actually done the labor of cleaning his own clothes. But anyway, I was just wondering if masculinity fit into his self-presentation for you.
Thank you very much for the question. Yeah, I mean, shame on me for not making the gender element more explicit. No, because it is such a pervasive element to this, right? And not only in the fact that the post-war technocrat was a very gendered thing. I was thinking of, I didn't mention her, but I was thinking of Nicole Rudolph's book, right? Talking about these sort of post-war planners and architects were, of course, all men who fancy themselves the expert who knows exactly how families should live, right? Without ever, at least initially, consulting housewives as to their actual needs. And he definitely had very much of the same kind of worldview, which is why I'm trying to connect him to that ethos, right? And it is interesting that the sort of notion of genius in terms of fashion creators is often reserved for men, right? And when you think of some of the most famous female fashion designers within haute couture, it is people like Coco Chanel, who only and Schiaparelli and all of these others who only emerged in the 1920s, right? In this sort of kind of destabilized moment. And in the post-war period, all of the sort of heralded new geniuses, Pierre Cardin, Yves Saint Laurent, Courrèges, they're all men who are seen as the geniuses. And so he definitely played into that. But what's interesting was it was his own self-presentation, but also that's how he was described. And so certainly the way he was positioning himself and kind of portraying himself made sense to others, and they used the exact same language. But
Hi, I'm thinking about what Tamara said about like staying in the men's clothes and never going back. And I want to apply it to over here. I'm kind of wondering where like the subjectivity is here of the women who are in these clothes. Like, how do they feel about that? And how do they feel? You know, who do they think they are when doing this? It seems like it's coming pretty much down from the top, I guess, is what the two presentations. And I'm kind of wondering what's going on the other way.
The two being.
Oh, they're two papers. They're two papers.
Okay.
They're two papers. I kind of feel like there are these prescriptions. These things are being designed,
right?
And I'm almost kind of hearing like there's an expectation that it's going to produce X, Y, or Z, right? And I got to teach. I finally got to teach the Modern Girl Around the World collection, right? Which deals a lot with that interplay of intersubjectivity, right? From women's point of view, right? Like the cosmetics don't make the woman makes herself with the cosmetics, right? That's what I'm wondering about that dynamic in your projects.
Could I tag on to that before you respond? Because my question is actually related to that, and that is that one of the things that you don't mention in your talk has to do with, and it's funny because you put Violette Morris up there, but I mean, she's known as a lesbian, right?
Yeah.
And you call it a breast reduction, but it's a mastectomy. She has her breast removed.
Right.
And that's very different from a reduction. I mean, I was a ballet dancer, and ballet dancers had breast reductions, but it wasn't a mastectomy that they were having done, right? So I think that I'm interested in whether or not under Vichy, as part of this sort of what women were doing with the sports and with the opportunity to wear these kinds of clothes, whether there was any concern about lesbianism. I mean, when we think of Martina Navratilova, we think of, there's so many women, I mean, she was adored by the kind of the lesbians of the 80s and 90s in France. And Violette Morris, right?
Of course, right.
That was something that you're kind of looking at this purely as if it's a heterosexual
No.
in this at least.
Yeah.
Right.
In the
Right.
In the article, I mean, you have to acknowledge her lesbianism, and of course, that's one of the principal critiques against her is that when because she adopts so much masculine sportive behavior, that must explain the lesbianism. That's not my point of view. Obviously, that's what people are writing about her. But once Vichy comes in, they're less concerned with lesbianism than they are, because functionally speaking, the Vichy Sports Ministry is a male ministry, and that's their principal concern is with shaping females' bodies as wives and mothers, and they're not really, although they do.
They don't see other women as threats.
Not really, presumably not. But the women who work in the sports ministry, many of whom are with Catholic federations and things like that, also aren't writing about lesbians, and that I think that is surprising because. Violette Morris is still around during the Vichy regime, although she's up in Paris and not down in Vichy's mines.
Torturing people.
Yeah.
Over to the Nazis, if you guys don't know.
Yes.
She actually gets shot right after the war.
Yes.
She's
Yeah.
by the French resistance.
Yes. But to get to your question, Robin, and that's why I wanted to mention this interwar period, because women throughout this period are the drivers of the adoption of these new sports fashions. But the Vichy regime doesn't invent women wearing shorts. They just look back to the interwar period and go, oh, we have these available models that we can use to promote different kinds of exercises. But they're doing it in a more normative way. And they say, look, we need women to be able to climb ropes. We need them to be able to do all this stuff. That's how we build balanced bodies. But they can't do that in a tunic because it's would be inappropriate sexually. It would expose them and embarrass them. So they're not actually asking women if this is a problem for them, for the most part, or at least I'm not seeing any evidence of that.
I guess I'm just wondering, those women on those rugby teams, like, how do they feel about that?
I don't. The women who are writing are not necessarily the women who are competing, and the women who are writing are engaging with this feminist politics. They think we're on these fields, we're becoming tough, and as we strengthen our bodies, we become the equals of men. That's why they wanted to play, some of the reason why they wanted to play the same sports. But for most of these women, they're silent. I don't know whether every woman on these, I mean, we're talking about hundreds and then thousands of women competing in these male-coded sports, but I can't speak to that. I mean, I think if you look at the sports literature, the sad answer is right now that is because soccer is fun, obviously, right? And that's why people play it. But I don't know that that's a sufficient, I'm not satisfied with that answer. I just don't have anything to say more.
Well, it is now 5:30. So let us thank our panelists again for this excellent session.